Morning. Today is Monday, September 18th, 2023, and on behalf of the Nashville Bar Association Historical Committee, we will be taking the oral history of a fascinating lawyer, Lionel Barrett. He practiced law here in Nashville for several years. He was known as one of the best criminal defense attorneys, and he's noted in write-ups to this effect, that he was one of the greatest criminal lawyers in Nashville. Lionel, we appreciate you giving this oral history. And to begin with, why don't you tell us your full name and a little bit about your family background and your education?
Oh, yes, my name is Lionel R. Barrett, Jr. My father worked for the federal government as a civil service employee, Department of Agriculture. I was a single child, and we moved from various places in Tennessee, and I was born in Nashville, but lived in Knoxville, Columbia, Jackson, Cleveland, Tennessee. Came back to Nashville, my father's employment, in 1955. I attended Montgomery Bell Academy, where I graduated in 1959. I then attended Vanderbilt University undergraduate, 1963, and law school graduated in 1966. This is probably not particularly relevant, but it was relevant to me. Politically, I am a Democrat. My father was a civil service employee. We were living at that time in Knoxville, Tennessee. President Eisenhower and the Republican Party just come into office, and they wanted to create positions for their supporters, patrons. That's understandable. So my father got a letter: in lieu of termination, you'll be moved to Columbia, Tennessee. We moved to Columbia. There 3 months. In lieu of termination, you'll be moved to Jackson, Tennessee. 5 months there. In lieu of termination, you'll be moved to Cleveland, Tennessee. There for, as seventh grade, I guess, 8th grade. In lieu of termination, you'll be moved to Nashville. By that time, the Civil Service Commission put a stop to all this folks moving around. And in retrospect, it really took a toll on my mother, all the moving and going around. But I do remember that when we moved to Nashville, we were in a small duplex on Cherokee Road and West End Avenue. And we had to give my dog away, our dog away. He was a white beagle. His name was Eagle Eye. And I made a promise to Eagle Eye: I will never vote for a Republican. You cannot make a promise to your dog. I've never done that. But that's really how, and I've known a lot of great Republicans. But that being said, that was basically Henry how I arrived back in Nashville in 1955 until 1966. When I graduated from law school.
What did you major in your undergraduate time?
History.
History. What did you?
Political science minor. I guess that's what it would have been called, Hal, and also got really 8 pretty easy semester credits for ROTC, Army ROTC.
Okay, and in law school, tell us some of your professors that you liked and didn't like.
Well, no, I think most of them. I certainly remember a professor named Robert Covington, fairly young professor, Professor James Kirby, Mr. Hartman, of course, Dean Wade. I thought most of the professors were really good. There was one professor by the name of Thomas Roady, R-O-A-D-Y, whose son was quarterback at the Vanderbilt football team. It was pretty well known that Professor Roady was not a very effective instructor. And at that time at Vanderbilt, I was a dorm advisor for most of the years I was at Vanderbilt, including law school, along with probably my oldest and closest friend, Frank Woods, who's now deceased, and Chancellor Bob Brent. We were all in the same dorm advising and taking care of freshmen. Well, we did not attend class on a particular regular basis. And the word got out that Professor Rhodey, I do remember, one morning, three of us said, let's go to real estate. We hadn't been there in 3 weeks or something. So we walk in, seating chart. We don't know exactly where we should be seated. Professor Rhodey comes in, upset, and he looks, and we were in not one of the large lecture rooms. We were in a smaller kind of classroom. Professor Rhodey came in, and he said, the ones of you that are here today will be the good lawyers. The people who have been cutting my class will not be good. It was generally felt that that was the best lecture anyone had ever given. He said, for the first time, I'm going to pass a roll around to see who's here and who's not, and see who the good students are. Well, that roll came back to the room where Frank and Bob and I were seated. Man, we put our name on there. He also said, let the word get out to all the first year class. Day after tomorrow, I expect everyone to be here. Well, the word got out, but because the law school knew that Professor Rhodey was not going to have great attendance, we were not in one of the large lecture halls. There were probably 35 or 40 students had to wait out in the hall because there were not enough room in the facility. And that just, and also Professor Sanders, who taught constitutional law. In that same small room where Professor Rhodey was, Frank and Bob and I were attending his class, and Chancellor Bob Barrett happened to be seated on an aisle chair. Well, it was obvious that Bob, during the lecture, had fallen asleep. Well, he somehow shifted and he fell out of his chair into the aisle. Well, Professor Sanders looks down and walks down to Bob Brandt, pulls on his ear.
Always did that.
Says, Mr. Brandt, are you okay? Are you hurt? Well, to this day, or that day, Bob said he was not asleep. Something happened that he just fell out of his chair. But that's the type of memory all of us possibly have of law school things, not about torts and things of this nature, but I would say overall I enjoyed the Vanderbilt Law School, and I thought the quality of professors was high.
Who taught you criminal law?
A young first year professor by the name, I think his first name may have been Lee, but his name was Patterson. He was only there for 2 or 3 years, but he taught. He was the professor that in our last year talked to Bob and several of us and let us know that the new attendance policy that it put in at Vanderbilt Law School, where in essence you could not, without severe penalty, miss any classes. And we were not told that at the first day classes our 3rd year. Professor Patterson told a few of us that that rule had been put into effect primarily for 3 or 4 of us that were working, law clerks, things of this nature. I was a claims adjuster for Eastern Airlines. But anyway, it certainly irritated us that, you'd have some few Vanderbilt students might come out and hung over and sleep, but, they didn't get penalized. But Professor Patterson, I do remember, was a young professor, let us know.
And what did you want to do when you graduated from Vanderbilt Law School?
Well, how I had for a long time known that I wanted to practice law. But because of my ROTC commitment at Vanderbilt, I had an obligation to active duty in the service. I applied for the Judge Advocate General for the legal branch. And to do that, you had to agree to a 4-year commitment rather than a 2-year commitment regular ROTC students had. So I knew that the first 4 years was going to be in the Army. I'd gotten a deferment to go to law school. And if I passed the bar exam, I would be in the Judge Advocate General's Court. If I failed the bar exam, I'd be a 2nd lieutenant driving a tank out of Fort Knox, Kentucky. So I really studied for the bar exam. I had a lot at stake. So I did spend 4 years active duty in the Army.
Well, tell us about that.
I was initially stationed at Fort Gordon, Georgia for 2.5 years. I was chief defense counsel for soldiers that had court martials, things of this nature. Then that time, we had the highest court martial rate of any post in the country from what we could tell. So a couple of the other lawyers and I, JAG also thought that the commanding general was court-martialing way too many guys, general court-martial. So I prepared a subpoena to see the records of the commanding general at Fort Gordon. So the three of us walked over to the general's office and I had a subpoena. And I talked to his staff and I said, we have a subpoena to see and study the military records of Major General Walter B. Richards. They looked at us. Yeah, we're not going to let you see the general's military record. We persisted. And they brought in a special military judge from Washington, D.C. Had a hearing, he ruled in our favor that we were entitled to review the convening authority, the commanding general's record. We reviewed them, found nothing at all that assisted our clients, but our military career took a decided downturn at Fort Gordon. So the three of us, I was moved from chief defense counsel to primarily writing up powers of attorney for folks that were going overseas. And I will certainly remember I was married. We bought a home in Augusta, Georgia. We just found out that my wife, Nancy, was pregnant. And no married lawyers had been sent to Vietnam. We had checked on that.
You were the first.
I was in the group of maybe 10 or 15 nationally.
What year was that?
That was in 1960. The word came in 68. I was transferred in 69, as were the other two guys. The three of us were the contingent from Fort Gordon that had to join the national levy to go to Vietnam. But I can still vividly remember in the colonel's office, Lieutenant Colonel headed up the office. After lunch one Friday afternoon, he asked me to come in and said, you got to be in Vietnam in 30 days. But anyway, that was a military service. When I came back to Nashville, I already had a commitment.
What did you do in Vietnam?
I was kind of a one-man law office down in the Mekong Delta, about 110 miles south of Saigon. It was just a general court-martialing, defending some court-martials, and just being on the staff of the commanding general. You had the chaplain, the lawyer, and so I served on the staff of the commanding general. And it was just doing any type of legal matter that came up. You know, for example, I remember a sergeant came in to see me. He was concerned about atrocities that some of the American soldiers were committing on bodies of the enemy. And I told him clearly that was wrong. So I reported it on his behalf to the commanding general's office. And then a few weeks later, I ran into commanding general's chief of staff, who said, we've solved the problem. We've moved Sergeant Sanchez 250 miles away. So that was how we resolved that particular problem. Being a one man, I had no direct supervision. I was assigned to Saigon, but attached to Can Ho in the Mekong Delta. It was really a great position because I had no direct supervisors. I was my own one man office, and had a sergeant and a Vietnamese secretary, three of us, and four of us in the office, another second lieutenant who had a low degree. So it was interesting. Came back to Fort Campbell, Kentucky. I still had about 4 months left on my original 4-year commitment.
Now, how long did you stay in Vietnam?
1 year.
1 year.
1 year to the day.
And your wife stayed in the United States?
Yes, I was there from April of 69 to April of 1970. My son was born while I was in Vietnam, and the first time I saw him was on our R&R leave to Hawaii, where my wife brought my son, who was in about 4 months old. That was the first time I had seen my son. Overall, I enjoyed the military service. I still, in most respects, am a supporter. But I did not like the Vietnam War. After being there a year, going over being kind of in favor, so to speak, seeing some of the things that went on, corruption, didn't think we should be this. When I came back to Fort Campbell, living on post, I had a handmade peace sign on my car, which was not a good move. And I had a Kent State article. Anyway, long story short, one afternoon, the commanding legal officer for Campbell calls me and says, "We've reviewed your records." Well, that's always a bad sign to say, "We've reviewed your record." He said, "You've got 4 months accrued leave that you'll be paid for when you leave the service. Would you be willing to take your leave and leave now?" I said, "Yes, sir." And they were trying to move a couple of us that were kind of anti. So I immediately came back.
Lionel, I want to take you back a little bit because you've been talking about how early you became sort of a seditionist and a rebel. But I have a memory that when you were in college, there was some stuff going on nationally and on campus. There was a lot of, during the 60s, a lot of tension over race issues and stuff. And I believe you were in student government in your
Yes,
undergraduate.
Henry, what you're referring to is that I was on the student senate at Vanderbilt. And at that time, Vanderbilt was segregated. No African-American students were allowed to apply at Vanderbilt. And several of us, including 1 year ahead of me, Lamar Alexander, we thought that was wrong. So we started advocating to allow African-American students to attend Vanderbilt. And we were able to have a campus-wide referendum where the students were allowed to vote. And the students actually voted not to, about a narrow margin, not to allow African-American students. But again, had some pressure from the administration to, kind of calm down, and this may give a bad name to Vanderbilt. The next year, I ran for president of the student body at Vanderbilt, basically on the platform of allowing African-American students to attend. And it was an election, one other junior, and his name Tom Abernathy. So I was defeated by a vote of, I think, about 1,100 to 800 in the campus election. But at that time, for some reason, administration required students to write on the back of a paper ballot either independent, the name of your fraternity, or the name of your sorority. And then they kind of calculated that. And as far as fraternity members, I was a vice president of my fraternity. I split even in the fraternity men, carried the independents. The sororities just wiped me out. I mean, most of the opposition, vocal opposition to African-American students, for whatever reason, came from the members of the sorority. And the vote was overwhelming against me. And now, see, I blame that on my stand on the integration issue. It may be that Tom was just like cooler than I was. The girls, that may have been the cause, but that was what, Henry, that was what, it was just about a couple years after that Vanderbilt did admit its first African-American student, one of whom was Perry Wallace, who was certainly an asset to our country and Vanderbilt. But I remember Chancellor Branscombe calling a few of us into his office and admonishing us that it was not time, or it was not the right time for African-American students to come. He assumed all of us, shared his view.
Why did he think that? Do you know?
Well, I don't know. I guess that maybe he had some old racist views. I don't want to denigrate him, but you have to remember, this is 1962, probably. And certainly there's a lot of discussion about integrating churches, universities, schools. But Vanderbilt finally did, and now 2023, Vanderbilt has one of the more diverse student bodies of most schools in the country. So there's been a lot of changes. But Henry, I remember I was a dorm laundry agent where the ones I was a dorm advisors could also be a laundry agent, where at night we would have students bring their clothes in, and then a laundry would pick them up and we got a commission. Got a commission of 25% on laundry and 30% on dry cleaning. And so we urge all the freshmen to get everything dry cleaned, particularly one of the fellows that you know, Roger May. Roger May was a quarterback signee that year, and he was in the dorm where Frank Wood is located. And my memory is that Roger always a nice dresser, got everything, underwear, everything.
Still is. It was the activist Stokely Carmichael. Did he come to speak at Vanderbilt while
He
you were
did.
there?
That was, if my memory's correct, Hal. He was probably after undergraduate. The new chancellor at that time was Alexander Herb, who widely respected, and he kind of broke tradition, invited Stokely Carmichael to come and speak, and he received, as I recall, a lot of criticism for that move. But the 60s were a very interesting time politically and going into the 70s also, and from a legal standpoint. And so I came back to Nashville in the spring of 1970 to begin my private practice of law.
Mr. King was killed in April of '68. Were you there in Nashville?
I was at Fort Gordon, Georgia.
Well, tell us about how you got into private practice.
I had, as a law student, I remember one afternoon, probably my second year of law school, on the bulletin board there at Vanderbilt, they had job openings or had notices, and I happened to see a little card on the bulletin board, said attorney with predominantly labor union representation seeking law clerk. And so I called the number, and it was attorney George Barrett, no relation. George had an active labor practice. I went up and interviewed, and for the last 2 years of my law school, I was a law clerk in the afternoon, as Henry can probably remember some of those days, going in and working as a law clerk after we got out of our classes. I had probably a leaning towards unions as opposed to management. And somehow I remember that Professor James Kirby was also involved in maybe speaking to me about that. I know that he somehow figured in my going to meet with George Barrett, who did have a predominantly labor law practice early on, out in the Stallman building in downtown Nashville. So I was there at law school working for George and the other lawyers there. And then I came back from the military service and went right back to practice law with George, Bob Brandt, for example. Also during that time, Senator Albert Gore the Elder had been defeated in re-election. So he came back for a short period of time and joined our law firm. Senator Gore came in and was there at that time in the Third National Bank. And that was interesting, having a former United States Senator. His wife, Pauline, many folks would say maybe was the brains of the operation. I mean, she was a very bright lady. The Third National Bank on the top of it had the City Club. The City Club would not allow women to attend. But we thought, George particularly, that Pauline Gore should be allowed to have lunch at the City Club. They said no. So George threatened a lawsuit, and we were certainly working on that. And they finally said, well, let's settle this. We'll let your law firm and Mrs. Gore in a private small dining room. Well, the ones of you that know George Barrett, that certainly did not suit George. He persisted. And she was allowed to attend there. So from 1970 until 1977, I practiced law with George, predominantly labor work, although it didn't take me too long to realize that I would kind of prefer criminal defense work. And some of the folks, like in the Teamsters Union, every once in a while, there'd be an alleged violation of some type of criminal statute, bomb somewhere or something of this nature. So anyway, I was there with George and certainly enjoyed it. Chancellor Bob Grant was also there during that period of time. Henry was there during that period of time. And other very close friend of mine, Attorney Charles Ray, was there with us. So it was a very interesting time. But in 1977, George represented Mayor Richard Fulton. And we all liked and worked for Mayor Fulton, also worked, I believe, as Jimmy Carter in a presidential campaign, and Senator Jim Sasser, kind of a Democratic activist law firm. So when Jimmy Carter was elected president, all the discussion was that George Barrett was probably going to be Undersecretary of Labor or maybe appointed in Sixth Circuit Court of Appeals. And we had a new office we moved into on 2nd Avenue that was part of some type of urban renewal. And George had gotten a really good financial deal on getting in and rehabilitating that building. So one afternoon on Friday, George comes in to see me. He said, listen, we need to get together and talk about the future of the firm. Well, this is when the speculation of George is going to be going to Washington, probably in some position. That time I was going through a divorce. Sounded pretty good, the future of the firm. So George comes in early the next week, sits down in front of my desk about where I'm facing you guys. Hi, George. He says, well, he says, you and I have different personalities. I want you out of here in 30 days. So I thought I was going up and I was going out. So I did relocate over to the Knoll Hotel building, but I thought George and I did have different personalities. And so he said, I want you out in 30 days. And I was able to make that transition very quickly to relocate. My secretary there at the firm, she came with me and we went over to the 9th floor of what I refer to as the old Knoll Hotel building.
Was Frank Woods was the president of the bank at that time?
Either then, no, I think it was probably a few years thereafter. Frank was actually president of Jake Butcher's bank here in Nashville.
At the Knoll Hotel.
Yes, that's right. And that's right, exactly right. But Frank had never I never practiced law directly with Frank, but we remained very close friends up until his death in 2010.
Well, did you go into an office by yourself?
I had a young lady attorney from the district attorney's office. That afternoon, when I found out I was going to leave, I walked over to her office and Tom Shriver's office and said, what would you think about coming and joining me in the private practice of law? And she agreed. So she was there. And I had a law clerk, a fellow named George Dean, who's now an attorney in Nashville. He was my law clerk. So there were the three of us at that time. And then she left for a variety of reasons. As a general rule, I don't want to go into too much detail, but lawyers in the same office should probably not date each other. I will simply leave it at that. But then I guess I was still in an old hotel when attorney Bill Reddick came and we practiced law together. Bill was a great guy. And there may have been some other lawyers that I may not remember, but shortly after that, we relocated office to 3rd Avenue. The office floor ran from 3rd Avenue to Printers Alley. And so I then hired 4 or 5, had other lawyers, young lawyers that came to work with me. And I told y'all on the phone conversation the day that working with young attorneys was something that I really, really enjoyed. Younger attorneys, and I really enjoyed all the folks that worked with me. I can think back on the folks, lawyers that I worked with and practiced law with were just really, really an outstanding group of people. Henry, looking at my notes, I do see something about the early practice of law, if I can diverge just a moment.
Please do.
But probably while I was with George in 1972 or 7, there was a presidential election. And it became known that the Tennessee Communist Party wanted to have a candidate on the ballot. Well, that was not a particularly popular position, but I was asked to represent them. And I remember George, liberal as he was, he said, I really don't think you want to represent the Communist Party. And I said, well, George, basically I do, or I move on here. So I did represent them, got the name on the ballot. But what I really remember is that the Metro Police Department came in and raided the Communist Clubhouse out of North Nashville. Maybe 9 or 10 professed communists had a clubhouse in North Nashville. The police came in to conduct some type of search and did some damage to the clubhouse. There was a African-American actress named Angela Davis, if my memory is correct. They had her picture on the wall, and the police department used it for a dartboard. They threw darts at the picture of Angela Davis. So on behalf of the Tennessee Communist Party, I filed a civil rights action against the Metro Police Department in federal court. That was probably doomed from the start, but we tried it before a jury. And the police department, represented by a great guy, later we became very close friends, Attorney Joe Binkley Sr. here in Nashville. He represented the police department. So we get down to closing arguments in my civil rights action. And somehow I thought Mr. Binkley had cast aspersions on my patriotism for representing the Communist Party. And so I looked at the jury and I say, well, I just think I should let you know that I just recently did return from Vietnam. Mr. Binkley stood up and said, which side you fight on? And I laughed. I thought that was one of the great, and the jury I didn't take offense. I thought I still remember that was just a great laugh. Well, which side were you on?
Who was the judge?
I think it was probably L. Claremont. And the jury was not out long to rule in favor of the Metro Police. I always remember Joe saying, which side did you fight on? I thought that was, again, I took no offense. I laughed along with everybody else that was just.
He was hard to dislike, Joe Binkley.
Oh, yeah. Joe was, and later on as the years went by, we tried several cases together and became very good friends. It was also probably during that approximate period of time that the Tennessee State Legislature passed a resolution after substantial debate mandating a moment of silence at the beginning of all public schools in Tennessee. Well, it was pretty clear that it was kind of a backdoor way of getting mandatory school prayer in schools in Tennessee. And so on behalf of a student and the ACLU, I filed again a federal lawsuit attacking the mandatory moment of silence. And it was deemed unconstitutional by an opinion written by Judge L. Morton, who was, generally speaking, a rather conservative Republican appointee, but I found to be a very fair, most of the time,
Yes.
a very fair judge. And so I do remember that when that was declared unconstitutional, looking back on it, that was something I enjoyed doing, having that, found to be unconstitutional.
Well, you also tried some cases, criminal cases in front of Judge Morton, as I recall, one of which I was on with you.
Oh, absolutely. How we talked about that the other day. Henry, you may know what Hal's referring to, was Judge Morton had issued, you correct me, Hal, you were the lead in that case, but Judge Morton had found a whole group of folks in contempt of court, in contempt of his order, as I recall, an order of his.
Peterbilt Motor Company, I believe.
That's right. And so there was a hearing with quite a few lawyers. Hal was our lead counsel. And there were some rate, it seems like, defendants. And the jury came back and found the defendants not guilty of contempt. And Judge Morton really did not appreciate that verdict. And I do remember that as the jury was leaving, or shortly after that verdict had been rendered, that Judge Morton said something to the effect that you jurors are discredit the system, some very out of character, some very inappropriate comment. And I guess as the jury was leaving, and maybe Judge Morton standing leave, Hal looks over at the jurors and says something to the effect, well, on behalf of all the defendants, we appreciate. Hal, you remember you remember exactly what you may have said?
Well, I said, after Judge Morton's remarks, I have to tell the jury that these defendants appreciate the jury verdict.
Oh, okay.
Then I thought I was going to jail, but I also, that was in the opening statements, we asked that the U.S. attorney go to jail, if you remember.
Oh, that's right. That's right.
That was quite a trial. Judge Everett was one of the defense attorneys. Jim Duran, he said that was his only criminal case he ever won. He quit while he was ahead. It was an interesting array of court-appointed lawyers.
That reminds me, when you mentioned Jim saying that would be the only criminal case he might have, probably again during the period of time, the early 70s, an attorney here in Nashville, John Buffalo. John and I somehow, we weren't court appointed, but we might as well have been, representing two young African Americans from Nashville who held up a Holiday Inn on I-40, and the inn happened to be in Grundy County, Tennessee. Well, Grundy County had in the years past, and even in the early 70s, it was well known, they had some very strong anti-Black sentiments. There used to be a sign in that town that if it's after dark, it's called a sundown town. You need to be out of here. So anyway, we agreed to represent the two young, moderately active Black kids. In the jail in Grundy County, it was so old that you could not stand up. The ceilings were only about 5.5 feet tall in an 1850s building. But really it irritated our clients, where they quite often, every once in a while, school students, first or second grade, they'd never seen a Black person. So they'd be brought by the jail and look at a Black person and say, look, there's a Black person. Well, that irritated our clients. But what I'm getting at, during the trial, I was voir diring folks on their racial views, and everyone said we can be fair and impartial. And I remember there was probably a 65-year-old farmer from Grundy County. I was voir diring him, asking about his racial views. Well, his face turned red, and it was obvious that he did not appreciate this line of questioning. And there's a pretty good crowd there, because in February in Grundy County, it's not a whole lot to do. So anyway, I said, sir, I can tell that my questions have really irritated you. would you hold that against our clients? And he said, I would not. It will help them. Well, I feel sorry for them having two such dumb lawyers. And there's this kind of raw undercurrent of approval in the courtroom. And so the judge looked at him and said, well, sir, maybe we should excuse you in this case. And John and I said, no, that's fine. We'll keep him. We'll keep him on the jury. We have no problem with that. Well, the jury came back and found the defendants either not guilty or guilty of some, it is a victory. I can't remember. And I remember that the district attorney and the police officer were really irritated. I mean, they were really upset. It was foggy on top of the mountain near Montague, Grundy County. And I told John, I said, we're leaving. I said, I know a shortcut off the mountain. You just follow me. So it was, this is true. It was foggy. It was actually foggy. John is behind me, and then we're about 4 miles outside of Altamont, and these blue lights come on and pull us over. And later on, John and I realized we were both thinking the same thing. Did we make them that mad? If something, it was just kind of ominous that we. So I rolled my window down. Sheriff comes up, as nice as he could be. He said, "You missed a shortcut. I'll help you out. I'll take you down." But that John, that was the last criminal. John told me that's it. He said that's the last criminal. To my best of my knowledge, I think he has kept his word. That was the last criminal. Now he's done very well, particularly in financial and bankruptcy type matters. But those are things that law school just doesn't get you ready for.
What else does law school not get you prepared for?
Well, I guess as far as Vanderbilt, there didn't seem to be a whole lot of preparation for the actual courtroom practice of law. And that was probably true, I suspect, at the vast majority of law schools in the 60s across the country. If I had to make a guess, I would say the University of Tennessee and the Nashville School of Law might have had a little bit more emphasis on actual being a lawyer, running a law office. Vanderbilt, great law school, seemed to maybe be more philosophical, international law, commercial transactions, things that would be helpful to the vast majority of their Vanderbilt law students, but maybe weren't particularly helpful to the ones that went into the private practice of law. How to run a law office, how to try a case. And I sure wish Vanderbilt had emphasized, be sure and collect your fees if you're in private practice. But I enjoyed law school. But again, I do remember this, that they had one course was taught by a professor that would not have won any awards in the student body for popularity, rightfully or wrongfully. I think his name was Herman Troutman. Well, Mr. Troutman had something called trial advocacy. We went through this course, and then there'd be a team of 2 students versus 2 students would try a case. And so Frank Woods and I were partners trying against 2 pretty wealthy Nashvilleian attorneys from Nashville. And so we convinced our opponents, hey guys, there's a lot of trouble. We'll pick the jury. We'll be glad to go out and get the students to serve on the jury. So we went to the students in the dorms where we were advisors, and we rounded up about 10 students to come down and serve on the jury. Well, I think it's a civil case. But anyway, we tried the case, and our jury won out very long and often. And they came back and ruled in our favor. And Professor Troutman I did not understand that. I just did not understand how that jury could have come back and made that ruling. Well, that made me, if I didn't, I think the selection of jurors in any trial, but particularly criminal cases and most particularly death penalty cases, is extremely important and about the most interesting thing one of them that a lawyer can do is jury selection. And I always enjoyed picking, or at least put a lot of emphasis on selecting juries in criminal cases.
Were you ever taught about the pitfalls in practicing criminal law and the things to look out for and the incredible things that can happen to you?
Well, I think it is certainly back in the years that I practiced, y'all did and still are, that the practice of criminal defense work can be, somewhat of a dangerous profession from the legal standpoint. To some extent, your clients, not all of them, but some clients just view you as a tool to help them out. Their loyalty to you is not very great, but that's okay. I mean, they're still entitled to fair trial, and we all tried just as hard as we could to make them have a fair trial. I can remember on one occasion, my primary law partner during, I'm moving ahead a little bit, Henry and Howell, maybe to the late 70s and maybe on into the 80s, but Rich McGee, we practiced law for a long time together, almost exclusive criminal defense work. And one afternoon, one of our clients, a young African-American on a drug charge, came in to talk with us. And he explained to us that things were going well, that he had bribed Judge Sterling Gray, that he had gotten a financial gift to Judge Gray. And Rich and I just looked at each other and like almost thinking, we kind of wish you hadn't told us that, because we were personal friends to some extent with Judge Gray. We verified in our mind that that actually did happen. And we notified the authorities. I guess probably the TBI, I guess, was the main agency, and I guess the district attorney's office. And then in looking back, some things that happened in Sterling Gray's courtroom made sense, where there had been a couple of rulings in defendant's favor that were so defense oriented that Rich and I just would shake our head. I remember particularly a gentleman I was defending named Raymond Pigg, who was a drug dealer with a lot of violence associated in his drug dealing. And he was facing very serious charges. We had a bond hearing, and I told Raymond, I said, listen, if we get $100,000 bond set in this case with your past record, violence, firebombs being thrown, you'll be lucky. He just looked at me, he said, man, we're okay. Had the hearing, Judge Gray set the bond at $10,000, which was dramatic, out of character. And at that time, that was before we had any indication of the financial. I'm convinced this day that Mr. Pigg must have gotten the money to Sterling's court officer, his nephew, who was a go-between for getting all of the money to Judge Gray. It really hurt us that Sterling, who's a good judge, generally speaking, ended up being indicted and charged, and then committing suicide and murdering his wife shortly before he was scheduled to go to trial. That wasn't particularly dangerous to us. That was, sorrowful to us, but, petitions for post-conviction relief, threats indirectly being made by, that your client is unhappy, or another lawyer's clients think you sold their lawyer out, and someone may come to your home and do something to you. And on at least two occasions, I remember that State Representative and Speaker of the House Jim McKinney and Sheriff Fate Thomas, on two separate instances, apparently had told some friends of mine that they were going to plant drugs in my car because of some serious run-ins that we had in court with both McKinney and Fate Thomas. So, sure, and clients sometimes might want you to do things that are improper. I used to tell young attorneys who come to work with our firm that you should view every client as a potential end or damage to your career. There's just too much room in some situations for criminal defendants to want to use their lawyers improperly. And and this is kind of indirectly related to your question, how when we knew that a lawyer was committing a crime or doing something that was dramatically unethical, and you had to report that attorney to the board of professional responsibility, that was always unpleasant.
Have any other experiences like that?
Well, yes, I remember one attorney in Nashville. He was younger than I, named Dennis Hughes. Dennis had graduated from the University of Virginia, where both my children, my son and daughter, both attended the University of Virginia. And it seemed like I might have asked Dennis to write a letter of recommendation. But he was a young attorney, very interested in criminal defense work, very enthusiastic. But it became pretty clear that some of his enthusiasm crossed the board of responsibility guidelines, where a client of mine, this was when I guess it was Glenn Funk and I were representing co-defendants in a federal drug charge, very serious charge. They had retained Dennis Hughes to represent them in the case. They scheduled an appointment with Dennis and with Glenn and I. They come into my office and we're talking with them, and they said that they'd become uncomfortable with their attorney, Dennis Hughes. And we said, well, Mr. Hughes is a good attorney. We don't want to said, no, we want to retain other counsel. During that initial conversation, they advised us that Dennis had told them that for a certain amount of money, that he would be able to take care of the case because the IRS investigator, for some reason, who was handling the case, that he knew him, and for X amount of money, he would bribe the agent, and that would take care of the case. That made them uncomfortable. So they came in the next day wearing a hidden tape recorder and got Mr. Hughes to explain to them exactly what he meant. And he again said, look, Agent Wally Druitt is a friend of mine. I know him. The deal's done. You get me the money and you walk, or words to that effect. We listened to the tape, Glenn and I. It turned out that I actually was a friend of Wally Druitt. I think I represented him in a divorce case and knew that that was totally bogus. So we reported that to the board of professional responsibility. Unfortunately, for whatever reason, the board took no sanctions against Dennis. But as the years went by, other more serious matters came about, and Dennis started spending a lot of time with some of his drug dealing clients, and he ended up being arrested and serving time for participating as an attorney in the drug deal, setting up the route the drugs would go, advising clients which is the safest highway to take. And a lot of other instances like that kind of clouded Dennis's. He did let it be known that he really didn't appreciate Glenn and I making the initial complaint. After he got out of prison, I ran into Dennis. He was driving for a limousine service here in Nashville. And he came by, and we happened to run into each other's service station. He apologized. He said, I want you to know that the hard feelings and the things I'd said about you and Glenn, that was my fault. I shouldn't have done what I did. He had attorney Rich McGee represented him contesting the disbarment proceedings that ultimately the Bar Association or the board had brought against him. And he had a lot of support. Dennis did. It looked like that he was one of those few people that maybe really had found religion in the right sense of the word to help him. And I remember that George Barbara Haynes and a lot of other folks came to his defense that he should not be disbarred. He has turned the corner. The local hearing recommended that he not be disbarred, but the board appealed it to the Tennessee Supreme Court and our Chancery Court. But it wound its way up to the Tennessee Supreme Court. And I remember a really good judge and been a criminal defense lawyer on the Supreme Court, which is a little bit unusual, Gary Wade from East Tennessee. Gary, in the opinion, said, we know that you have rehabilitated yourself. You should be highly commended for what you have done. But the offenses that were committed are such that we feel compelled to recommend permanent disbarment. So that's just an example that comes to mind of, where it's a different world, I suspect, from being maybe an attorney at, any large civil firm, whether it be Bassbury and Sims, Waller Lanston. I just think that the field of criminal defense work has potentially more landmines out there, and divorce work too. I think the little bit of divorce work I did, I've often heard said that it's one thing to practice criminal law or to practice divorce. Don't do them together. It will just cause you to have a nervous breakdown. And I think my limited divorce work led me to kind of understanding.
Did you ever have to work with any other federal authorities or state authorities on public corruption cases?
Well, Hal, yes. The one that I guess comes to my mind the most was probably in the late 70s, maybe early 80s, whenever Ray Blanton was near the end of his term as governor. A client of mine that I had represented her and her husband for a very long period of time. They had named one of the children after me. The husband's father was a friend of mine through our mutual interest in avocational archaeology. Anyway, my client, Cheryl, really liked her. She came in very outgoing, and she said, I have really got good news. Her husband at that time, John, was serving like a 10-year sentence for armed robbery. She says, I'm buying John's way out. And I say, Cheryl, what do you mean? She said, well, yeah, I'm getting an initial $10,000 to Attorney Dale Quillen, and Dale will then deliver it to the legal counsel for Governor Blanton, and a pardon will be issued before Governor Blanton goes out of office. I say, Cheryl, the system doesn't work that way. I called the United States Attorney's Office, Hal, Joe Brown. It seems to me it may have been Joe, but anyway, I got on the phone. I said, listen, I've got a client saying she's getting ready to give a bribe to the governor's office, and I just want to verify she's getting ready to be ripped off. Don't let her leave. So the United States Attorney and, head of the FBI, Hank Hillen, come over. And they said, we have been investigating this, but we've come to a roadblock, a standstill. We just need something more, and we think this can be it. I had no idea that this investigation was going on. But anyway, Cheryl reluctantly agrees to cooperate. The only promise that the authorities could give to her in exchange for her cooperation and her husband's cooperation in prison, that when he regularly appeared for parole hearing, they would point out the great assistance that had been given and that they would recommend legitimate parole. Cheryl agrees to go to Dale Quillen's office wearing a wire. She later went into Eddie Sisk and Charlie Benson, legal counsel's office, wearing a wire. And I do remember that she went into Dale Quillen's office, criminal defense lawyer, who he and I had a good relationship. We had been friends. And so we're with the Hyatt Regency monitoring the conversation. And the transcript ultimately was prepared. And I do remember Dale telling Cheryl, don't tell Mr. Barrett, he doesn't understand how politics works. It was clear, crystal clear, what was happening. Cheryl then goes into the legal counsel's office, wearing a wire, and is talking to Charlie Benson, who was second in command to a friend of mine named Eddie Siss, who was the governor's legal counsel. This is the one, I think at this time was probably when we were monitoring over at the Hyatt Regency. But anyway, Cheryl goes in, and before she goes into their office, she decides, one, that she needs to go to the ladies' room and use the restroom. She does that, and there is a recorder, transmitter also. And she says something like, gentlemen or guys, it's very embarrassing. I got to use the ladies' room. While she was there, she relocated the recording device that was down in her lower body area. Okay. She walks into the governor's office, meets Charlie Benson, and then we hear, Charlie, what are you doing? What are you doing? He was frisking her. He says, well, we've heard rumors for some reason that we may be under investigation, and we want to make sure you're not wearing a wire. So he probably missed that recording device probably by no more than an inch or two. And then he says, okay, Cheryl, now maybe later on you and I can get together and I can do a more thorough search. If you understand. Well, this scares the young lady. I mean, what would have happened if they had discovered that wire? This whole investigation might have been compromised. But anyway, goes on, and her testimony and the transcripts certainly were important in Eddie and Charlie and Dale Quillen being arrested and charged in that case. There wasn't any question about it. Pardons were being sold. On one occasion, Cheryl's husband, John, was at the Turning Center down in my now home of Hickman County, Tennessee. Dale talks to Cheryl and says, what I'd like for you to do is you and I go down to the Turning Center, and you have your husband, John, round up some of his buddies down there, maybe 5 or 6 guys that also think that they would like a clemency petition. So we'll go down to clemency. So we'll go down there. And they did. They went to the Turning Center, and Dale talked to quite a few inmates about money for clemency. I found going to the Turning Center just almost like, wow, man, that is beyond brazen. Anyway, it turns out that Governor Blanton is removed from office a day or two early. He's sworn in secretly, so to speak, by the Tennessee Supreme Court because there were other clemency petitions on his desk they knew, including a client of mine, that they were getting ready to be signed. So then they would go out, as I understand it, and notify the Blanton family that you're no longer governor and you need to leave the mansion, or words like that. Well, Hal, let me go on if I could and turn to one that really is more significant, possibly to the Nashville Bar Association. And this is one that I remember probably better than the Cheryl case. This is where a client of mine named Robert Waddy, who had Waddy Bonding Company, that I use quite a bit and have become friends with. Mr. Waddy and his daughter were charged with a criminal offense. I think Mr. Waddy was actually charged. He had hired 2 former vice squad officers to break into the criminal court clerk's office and steal various records of items where his clients had not been captured. He owed a lot of money to the clerk's office. Be that as it may, Mr. Waddy was facing criminal charges before Judge A.A. Birch, who I already had not had a particularly pleasant relationship with. But anyway, Mr. Waddy had been contacted about this by attorney Jim McKinney, who had been Speaker of the Tennessee State Legislature and did not enjoy a very good reputation, as far as I could tell, among the Bar Association. Anyway, Mr. Waddy comes and contacts myself and another attorney, Price Nimmo, and indicates that he's been approached by McKinney about a bribe. And Mr. Waddy was honest enough in his own way to report it. So then again, we report this to the TBI primarily, and I guess also to this attorney's office. So Mr. Waddy agrees to wear a wire, and has a telephone conversation, I guess, with McKinney. Now, Jim, just exactly what am I supposed to do? And McKinney says, Waddy, done son of a bitch, I told you what you need to do. Get the money together, check into the hospital, get this case continued, let me get the money to the man, and I think you're going to be okay. All right. So I make arrangements to check Mr. Waddy into Madison Memorial Hospital. And he wasn't in the best of health, but he was competent to go to trial. So the TBI puts microphones around the hospital room that he is in, waiting for Miss McKinney to come out there, pick up the money, and discuss the case further. Well, this is where the case takes a really unfortunate turn. All of us know, and Hal and I maybe even more, Tom Shriver, who was a district attorney. And Tom and I had developed a good relationship and we're friends. The first African-American judge that Tom hired, assistant district attorney that Tom Shriver hired, was A.A. Birch. Tom had a blind spot for Judge A.A. Birch. I remember that we had a meeting, Tom, the TBI and I, and for reasons I don't understand, we met in a secluded location in Shelby Park to discuss this ongoing investigation and how the takedown would be made or whatever. Shortly thereafter, Tom calls up Judge Birch and says, you won't believe this. Jim McKinney is saying you're getting ready to take a bribe to help old man Waddy out. That's the end, for all practical purposes, of the investigation. I had not immediately been made aware that that had happened. I was going in Judge Birch's court probably on a Friday morning. I filed a motion to continue the case of Mr. Waddy because he was seriously ill. So I am literally at the door of Division 3, and a TBI agent comes up and says, don't go in there. The deal is blown. Judge Birch knows what's going on, and if you go in there with your motion, you're gonna get in trouble for filing a motion. It's not accurate. That's the least part of it. But anyway, that was the end of the investigation. And I assure you, the TBI and United States Attorney's Office, the FBI particularly, I mean, you know, they were just incensed that Tom had done that. I think it was out of his friendship for Judge Birch. Some of the other law enforcement agencies were not quite as charitable, because I think that probably might fall under the statutory violation of obstruction of justice, obstruction of the authorities just could not believe that Tom had tipped Judge Birch off. And Judge Birch knew that I represent Waddy. It didn't take him long to figure out. And then there were several other instances I had with Judge Birch, campaign violations and financial violations, some other matters. I also remember that way before this happened, Judge Birch was seeking re-election, and his opponent was a Nashville attorney named Jude Linehan. So Judge Birch comes to my office, and this would have been probably, I suspect, maybe even while I was with George Barrett, but he came by wanted a campaign donation. And I was a young attorney in years of practice. And I said, Judge, I can't. I'm a good friend of Jude Linehan. I said, you're going to win. Everybody knows you're going to win, I think, this election. But Jude Linehan is a good friend of mine. And I'm sorry, I just cannot support you or make a campaign contribution, even though I was in his courtroom probably every week. Now, in looking back on it, it probably would not have been unethical on my part to say, good luck, Judge. I think you're going to be reelected, and here's $50. But I didn't. I said, I'm sorry, I can't, because I support Mr. Linehan. And so Judge Birch and I had a running series of, they finally got to the point where I just, if I had a client whose case was in Division 3, I would turn it down. I remember on one occasion, I had just a routine motion to continue. And the district attorney's office had agreed that this criminal trial was going to be starting on a Monday, should be continued. When in question, we all agreed it should be continued. So on a Friday morning, I'm there to hear my motion. It's uncontested. 9 o'clock, 10 o'clock, 11 o'clock, all these motions are being heard. By the time we get to noon, I'm the only lawyer still left in the courtroom. My motion hadn't been heard. And no, I'm sorry. I know what had happened. I was the only lawyer left in the courtroom. And I asked his clerk, Vicky, I said, Vicky, what about my motion to continue this case? I think this was actually Hal and Henry on a Thursday morning. For some reason, court scheduling, all the motions were being heard on a Thursday morning before Judge Birch rather than on a Friday. I'm still seated there at noon on Thursday. And, you know, she goes back to talk with him, comes out, she says, the judge told you that these motions are always heard on Friday. I said, I understand. But the Friday docket had been moved to Thursday, and the trial is set for Monday. He's not going to hear you. It was obvious he was harassed. I called this attorney. I said, you want to continue this more than I do. You talk, to Judge Birch. But, and this is one, when we talked on the phone the other day, this is one I just now remember. Very similar. That I was representing a young man who was charged in criminal court with accessory after the fact to the theft of over $100 worth of meat. A buddy of his went into a meat, this is true, went into a meat market and stole some meat, shoplifted some meat, and they caught the guys outside the store. Well, the district attorney and I had agreed without any question that he was going to retire the case against my client, had no criminal record, just turned 18, totally normal. So we had agreed that he was going to retire the case. So we're having a day of announcements in Judge Birch's court. And the district attorney stands as a yawner in this case. We agree with Mr. Barrett, the state moves to retire this case. Judge Birch looks over at us and says, I've got some reservations about this. General Williams, see if you can, I'm going to take a break and see if you can come up with a valid reason why this case should be retired. So then Judge Birch leaves and Vicky, his clerk, comes down to where Scott Williams and I are seated. She shouldn't have. She said, you know what Judge Birch said? No, don't teach Lionel Barrett support Jude Linehan. The district attorney, who was a very gentle, good guy, he says, that son of a bitch. So Judge Birch comes back in. So General Williams, you thought of a reason why this case should be retired? No, I haven't, Your Honor. And for that reason, the state of Tennessee takes a straight outright dismissal. But that was because he knew that Judge Birch was playing games with him. So he said, no, I can't And we nolly the case, and it's dismissed in such a way, I mean, the court had no authority.
Now, let me take you in a little different direction
Sure.
because I know there's more about you than being a lawyer. You mentioned your interest in archaeological.
Oh, yeah.
things. Can you tell us a little bit about your?
Well, I have always had, one of my primary interests has been in archaeology, pre-Columbian culture. So going back to even high school, my father and I would walk out in fields, collect Indian artifacts. And I continued that all the way through even until this day. And I was active with local archaeology groups, Vanderbilt University, and amateur archaeology groups. And so we would make a point to locate pre-Columbian remains, Indian mounds. And I still have a large collection, although quite frankly, as the years gone by, I've sold most of it except for things I personally found. I've taken trips to Honduras, Belize, Central America, Peru, because of my interest in archaeology, the Mayan culture, the Inca culture. So I've walked many a creek bank. I've walked a lot, and now a lot of the fields haven't been turned or plowed in a long time. So it's a lot harder to find Indian artifacts, but it's always a love of mine. Studying it, Mound Bottom, which is a center out in Cheatham County, a large pre-Columbian center. I helped work with an organization of which I was president to save Mound Bottom that's getting ready to be sold. The state finally agreed to buy it, and it's now a national state park. But I have always been interested in archaeology and going to different places. If somebody said, "What is your prized possession of a material value?" It was some artifacts I found in Georgia when I was in station Fort Gordon, Georgia. Some very beautiful artifacts, spear points, knives that go back 6,000 or 7,000 years old. And I spent probably every other weekend for a couple of years out on the banks of Briar Creek, a large creek in southeast Georgia, collecting these artifacts, which I've saved. And they really have become, I've written an article from Archaeological Journal about the years I spent on Briar Creek. But that is, it's always been instrument. I will tell you, Henry, that it is an instrument to get away from the practice of law. Well, there was two collectors that I knew from Middle Tennessee, one of whom was totally crazy, and my client to be was only partially crazy. They were out collecting Indian artifacts on the banks of the Cumberland River here in Davidson County, and they had some type of confrontation, and one collector picks up the other one, takes a couple of his Indian artifacts, and shoves him into the bank, into the Cumberland River. He is charged with aggravated assault and theft, to wit, the theft of 5 Indian arrowhead artifacts and pushing the guy in the Cumberland. And I thought, guys, I can't even get away from the practice of law, but it was my hobby. And the case was finally resolved without a jury trial, but I suspect that all of us, or at least the vast majority of us, would like have a hobby, something that particular, like you guys and other criminal defense lawyers and people, lawyers and people, that you need to have some change of pace. For me, even now, Vanderbilt football. Well, that only makes the situation worse. I mean, how bad can I remember on one occasion when I was married, that we went down, my wife and I went down to Ole Miss to watch Vanderbilt play Ole Miss football. Well, I probably had a jury trial that week. I know I was not the best of moods. Anyway, we drive down to Oxford, Mississippi. There we are watching Vanderbilt play Ole Miss with a few other Vanderbilt fans. About 5 minutes, maybe 7 minutes into the first quarter, Vanderbilt's behind 16-0. I say, Julie, we're out of here. We're leaving. She says, but it's only midway through the first quarter. I've been doing this for too long. I know what's getting ready to happen. I'm just not going to sit here. Well, the other few Vanderbilt fans said, where are you going? I said, I'm going home. Well, the final score was like 46-3. So I made it one. No, it's stupid to drive to Oxford, Mississippi, pay for a ticket, be there and support your team, and leave midway of the first quarter. I acknowledge it. I shouldn't have done that. It was irrational on my part. But at the time, I'm not going to stand it. I'm out of here.
You've been kicked around all you need to be kicked around.
But one of the other interests I have that indirectly ties into the practice of law is, excuse me, is music. I have always loved music. In my very younger days, when I started practice law, I did a little bit of songwriting, not particularly successful, not very talented in the area of learning to play a guitar, but I really, really love music. So when I would be representing someone who was legitimately in the music industry, like Roy Acuff's grandson, or actives to this day, musician named Steve Earle, or Tanya Tucker, or anyone that was in the music industry, that would really, I really enjoy it. I'm like, wow, these people I admire them. They're actual musicians. And in retrospect, I wish that I had told them, I really love music. Can I just come out and go to recording sessions and hang out with you? But I didn't. But when I represent folks in music industry, I really got excited. Like, this is somebody like I really admire, like a songwriter who at that time, he had the #1 hit. It was recorded by an artist named Keith Whitley. Well, he'd gotten in a domestic assault charge back in probably the early 90s. He'd been in jail in the weekend. So he hired me. I went over to help him make bond and get out. We were walking to my office. And I said, listen, man, I know I love you. You've got the #1 song called I'm No Stranger to the Rain. Man, that is great. He said, I don't care. He said, all I want to know is I'm going to go back to jail. So we went over to my office and I represented him, but there was a transference. The lawyer was talking about music, and the musician, he didn't want to talk about music. He wanted to talk about love. And this is a part of trivia that probably maybe not too interesting to any generations to watch this in the future, but I got a phone call one afternoon from a fellow who said, my name is Robert Feller, F-E-L-L-E-R, and I have a DUI second offense. Would you consider representing? I said, sure. I said, Mr. Feller, what is your employment? He said, I'm self-employed. And then I said, did you happen to write Biff the Friendly Purple Bear? I did. I wrote Biff the Friendly Purple Bear, which is a cute little country song that was never #1. But it was about a guy going through divorce, and about the only thing he had left from his son was Biff the Friendly. It was a neat song. I knew it had been written and recorded by a local artist named Bobby Feller. So when he said, I'm Dick Feller, by an artist named Dickie Feller. So I took this hunch when he said self-employed, and I said, you write Biff the Friendly Purple Bear. What if this had been a Richard Feller who was an insurance agent? And the lawyer says, did you write Biff the Friendly Purple Bear? He'd say, no, I didn't. But on second thought, I think I ought to be sure of that.
Well, tell me about A Party of One.
Well, Henry knows how to really flatter a person or get a person's attention. I did write a song called Party of One. There's no such thing as a party of one. It's a fancy way of saying you're all alone. Went down to the pizza place, ordered a pizza to go. Anyway, it's about a guy, when you say I'm a party of one. That party of one is just a fancy way of saying you're all alone. And I walked the king size pizza back home and poured us a dish of wine. but the cat didn't like sausage and cheese, and I was asleep by 9. And anyway, it won an award for in some type of amateur songwriting contest for being in the first or second place. And I never really pursued that, but I really, every once in a while, I'm still working on a couple of songs I've been thinking about for 25 years. But I really do like, and when I was practicing law, if I'm in my office at night or on the weekends, unfortunately, I'd always have some like a little stereo system. I'd be listening to music while I'm I think the highlight of my musical career, which is very limited, extremely limited, was there was a folk musician, y'all I'm sure have not heard of him. His name's Tom Russell. Very popular in England and here. But I really enjoyed Tom Russell's work. And he played here at a place out on 8th Avenue. And I went and he was playing, and I went with some friends to hear him. And I told him, I said, Mr. Russell, I am really one of your biggest fans. I said, I know what it was. I told him, I said, at the present time, I'm representing musician Steve Earle on some pretty serious drug charges here in Davidson County. I said, and by the way, when I tried death penalty cases, when I'm in my office, I have usually one of your CDs going. I said, that's what's true. I really, really enjoyed your music. I went and spoke to him at a break between his sets. And he comes back, and I told him a couple of songs I really liked of his. And he came back to start the second set. He said, I want to dedicate this set to Steve Earle and Lionel Barrett. And then he played. I'm sure they were not necessarily scheduled to be on what he was going to perform. Now he played those, two. So anyway, when he said, I'm like, which was nice for a musician to do. I mean, to remember some guy that
Quite an honor to you.
comes up and says that, but I always did enjoy music. I think, and again, this is probably kind of sidetracked a little bit, but one of the other things I always enjoyed was playing basketball. I was never very good, but I was okay, kind of, maybe. And I used to play quite often with Frank Woods. We'd go down to the Vanderbilt gym. The bars, now this directly ties in. The Nashville Bar Association sponsored a basketball league for a couple of years. And so you could have firms, you could have teams, and we played out at the old, Cohen High School in the gym there. So Barry and Sims had a team, and the Attorney General's office had a team. So Glenn Funk and I, we had a team called the Plea Bargains that we had jerseys made of and entitled the Plea Bargains. And so we recruited a few other lawyers to play on our team. And quite frankly, I think we recruited a guy who wasn't a lawyer, but he was a client or something that was a good basketball player from Memphis. We kind of slipped him in, and we shouldn't have done that. But I remember the first game that we played against a fairly large civil firm. I'm sorry, I can't remember right now who it was. But we played, and my two stepsons who had lived with me for many, many years, and both were all-state basketball players. And my wife, she played at that time, her name's Julie. She had played basketball in high school. They tell me, you can't go out at the age of 50 or whatever. You can't go out there and run up and down that court. You got a heart attack. You'll just drop over. Well, I don't know. First game we played, I took three three-point shots in a row. Hit all three three-point shots and a 2-point. I scored 11 points in the first 6 minutes of the game. It was a fluke. It was just one of those things that happened. And I'm looking over my wife and stuff. But anyway, the Bar Association sponsored that. The only victory, and we lost, the only victory the plea bargains had, we won by default when Neil and Harwell failed to show up for the game. And I remember one game that Glenn Funk, who was basically what we called back in those days our center, Glenn Funk got into a serious fight with a senator from the state attorney general's office. And both of them were ordered out of the gym, But the bars, we took that, listen, we took that seriously. And there was one attorney in the game I wasn't involved with, but he seriously injured his knee playing basketball in the Bar Association League. And I understand he had to have maybe ACL surgery. He filed a workman's comp claim and prevailed. That injury was caused largely by the fact that it was in pursuance of helping his employment. That is, his firm was so that was one of the, also, I believe the Bar Association sponsored this. Then probably maybe during that same period of time, Vanderbilt Gym for at least 2 or 3 years had a charity game to allow money to be raised between the Jawbones, the lawyers, and the Sawbones, which were the doctors. And we beat them, the Bar Association, we beat the doctors each of the 2 or 3 years, that we played. And it raised money for some charity. But the doctors we beat those guys every time. And so that was interesting. I had a young lady lawyer working at my law firm during that period of time that had played basketball in high school. And so she was the first lady to play in the Jawbones and the Sawbones. But those were interesting. So the Bar Association has done a lot of things done that are very commendable. We're having Jawbones and Sawbones in the basketball league. I mean,
Well, I want to go back to a time when you just first started practicing law and you were over here on 3rd Avenue.
yes.
Will you verify the fact that you had a parrot in your office? Yes or no?
Yes.
Yeah, okay, that's fine. And did that parrot also, when a client would come in, did he say, fee cash?
No, what Fred the parrot would say, pay your fee. Now he didn't necessarily say it to every client, but he said it most of the time. And I've had several people remind me of this. It is embarrassing.
Yeah.
The Fred, who was a green and yellow parrot, I really like Fred. He stayed there in our office. And quite often I'd be talking to a client.
Yes.
And Fred the parrot would jump up on my shoulder and decide it's time to use the bathroom. And so there I'd be sitting and talking to Mr. Barrett, your parrot, I'm afraid.
Well, yeah, moving right along, Lionel. Now I understand that you are a goat farmer. Is that true?
Hal, I am in many respects a goat farmer. I have a herd of 31 goats. But I'm probably not a goat farmer because farming implies you make some money. These are just pets. That the place I purchased in Hickman County, Tennessee, in the community of Little Lot, the fellow had some goats. And I love animals. I'm the present secretary of the Hickman County Humane Association. Anyway, I love goats, so I took over the goats. He sold me his place, 3.5 acres, and then he and his wife built a place next door. So and he and I are very good friends. But I took over his herd, which was about 16 at that time. Now I have 31 goats that I'll have to say more work than I'd envisioned. I have a barn. I go out and load hay and work on the fences, and quite often the goats will manage to get out of the fence and will get on the road, the highway, and I have to go and try and herd them back in. Answer your question, yes, I have 31 goats.
Well, I have also heard that you do not sell these goats.
That's correct.
And so therefore, the population, the herd is getting larger and larger.
Many neighbors have said, you need to do something about the size of your herd.
And has there been some comments about inbreeding of goats that's happening?
There has been. I think it's fair to say that there is inbreeding. And for the ones of you who are fortunate enough never have witnessed goats mating, you're very fortunate.
I'll leave that there.
I mean, their ritual that they go through, guys, oh man. And
Well, Lionel, we've come a long ways. Anything else you'd like to add to your oral history?
well, I do enjoy them, although most of them, a lot of them have names. A few of them I haven't. Oh, and it really is. Periodically, a goat will pass away, and I'll have to bury it. And that to me, because I love it, is really sad to have to. I have been, in the last 2 weeks, I've been bottle feeding a little baby goat whose mother passed away about 5 weeks after birth. So I track him down and have a plastic bottle and nipple with milk, and I'll hold him and bottle feed him so he looks. Now, if someone had said 6 or 7 years ago, do you think you might be bottle feeding a goat in Hickman County? I would have said, well, I hadn't really thought about it. It sounds okay, I guess.
Well, why don't you reflect a little bit now on back on your career and what you just
Well, well, I will say often down in Hickman County, I will reflect back on my practice of law. And I can say that overall, it was a very rewarding and a very interesting profession. I can certainly say that having the opportunity to meet Henry, Hal, you guys, Charlie Ray, Rich McGee, and I could go on with a litany of folks I practiced law with, were among the best folks that you would ever meet. My oldest now and closest friend is an Alabama attorney who was a non-JAG officer. He was in the infantry when I was in Vietnam, and I was allowed to recruit one other non-JAG officer to my office. And I asked him to come work with me, and we have remained extremely close friends to this day. His mother, who's now passed away, was a noted national short story author in a small town in Alabama. In her autobiography, she wrote, Captain Barrett saved my son's life. And I don't think that's the case, but he and I remained very close friends through the years. I became friends in some respects with some of my clients. I can think of, and I hadn't even thought about this in this question that asked, but I can think of at least off the top of my head, 2 guys here in Nashville that are up in their 70s that I represented on criminal charges that have gone on, and we talk all the time. One of them was a young African-American guy that had a drug charge. He's now become a very prominent Nashvilleian. And a friend of mine that went on to work is now retired from the fire department. He failed, and he wouldn't mind me saying that. He failed a marijuana test when he was in the fire department. And a friend of mine named Buck Dozier terminated him for failing the drug test. Somehow we appealed it on some ground. It was over, his suspension was overturned, and he went back to the fire department. He's now retired and is a musician, but he and I talk probably 3 or 4 times a week. Clients, I guess what I'm probably not particularly articulately saying is that the people I got to know and meet in my practice of law, the vast majority were lawyers, and all of people. We all have made mistakes. I certainly have. A lot of my clients obviously made mistakes. I could count on one hand the number of folks I represented that I could say had no redeeming feature, none, zero. And one that did have some notoriety was a tax assessor in Putnam County, Tennessee, named Byron Low Tax Looper. And he ran for the state Senate against a very beloved incumbent by the name of Tommy Burks. Shortly, I was representing this gentleman on malfeasance and office charges. A week or shortly before the election, someone assassinates Senator Burks at his farm outside of Monterey, Tennessee. Doesn't take long for the authorities to zero in on Byron. He had changed his name legally. He had changed his name to Low Tax, Byron Low Tax Looper. He had been, initially, he had been accepted at West Point military academy, but he got kicked out or he left for some reason. I got to know Mr. Looper, who was a very unusual, arrogant person. But anyway, after he is a suspect in the killing of State Senator Looper, I've contact my friends of mine in that case. Listen, your client is primary suspect. So I called him up. I tried to call him up. He had kind of absented himself from the scene. The TBI, they couldn't find him. I finally got in touch with him somewhere down in his home state of Georgia. And I said, Mr. Looper, you're in serious trouble. I said, you are the primary suspect in the murder of Senator Burks. You and I need to get together quickly to discuss your case. The only time I allowed, to my knowledge, a client of mine to meet me at my home, at that time, the Hillwood area, I said, Mr. Looper, I'll meet you tonight at 9 o'clock at the Bellmead Theater, and you can follow me to my home and we'll discuss your case. At this time, there's a search on for Byron Looper. And so I'm talking to Mr. Looper in my home. My wife is in the back bedroom watching the 10 o'clock Channel 4 news. And then they have an announcement on the news that says, Byron Looper has been returned to be the primary suspect in the shootings, murder of State Senator Tommy Burks. If anyone knows his location, should immediately contact the authorities. And she's thinking, he's in the den. He's in the den. So anyway, I talked to Mr. Looper, and it became pretty clear, while he never quite admitted it, it was obvious that he committed the crime. We had the preliminary hearing in his case, and it did attract a lot of attention. Quite a few television cameras are up there. Well, at the preliminary hearing, this is a legal aspect of preliminary hearing, he told me we're in good shape. I've got a solid alibi. A close friend of mine will testify that I was in Arkansas at the time of the shooting. Okay. The state somehow tracked down this alibi witness, and they put him on the witness stand at the preliminary hearing to say that either he had given the gun to Mr. Looper or Mr. Looper had come to Arkansas. It was devastating. I mean, this testimony just absolutely, along with a few other things, this testimony just wiped us out. After the hearing, I'm back in the cell with another lawyer talking to Mr. Looper. And I remember his saying, this adverse publicity really, really irritates me. And I say, why is that, Mr. Looper? He says, it's going to really make it very difficult for me in the future to get my law degree and practice law. And I said, Mr. Looper, let me tell you something. In representing people like you and a few others, it kind of makes me wonder why in the world I'm practicing. Here's a fellow that's facing potential death. He says, I'm worried about the fact it's going to damage my chances to get a law school and practice law. And I'm like, man, you got a lot of things more serious than worrying about law school.
And so, you know this, as a result of that murder, Tennessee Constitution was amended. Tell them about
Oh,
that.
that's right. No, actually, I do remember now that Mr. Looper apparently thought that if the murderer, or if the candidate was deceased within 30 days of the election, that he would automatically, I don't remember the exact detail. I know that that Mrs., the wife
Right.
of Senator Burks was very respected, and she was elected to fill that position. I do know that he caused the statute of the law to be changed, where no longer is going to be your benefit if you go out and get rid of your opponent, I think within 30 days.
Well, there was a provision in the Tennessee Constitution that prisons shall be comfortable, or some words to that effect. And Mrs. Burke got that amended to remove it from the Tennessee Constitution.
Wow. Well, he was, somehow it had been known or come to his attention, maybe my attention, that he had a dog that he lived with in his home, that he apparently swindled from a lady as a tax assessor, but that's another issue. But the somehow that it was rumored that maybe some dog hair, so forensic evidence was going to be important. He killed his dog that night. He went home. But we've all met. I suspect the three of us could all say that if we could have had a wish, and you guys, well, in our career, that if we could have the right to have chosen 3 clients that we represented, if we could do anything to go back, and as Hal, I think, may have mentioned the phrase, the clients from hell, that if we could go back and get, I can tell you, whether they were right or wrong, or, man, there were some clients that were just awful. And maybe it's even, and maybe their families were even worse than the clients. I mean, like, gee, I mean, just, I remember now, I would represent most folks, but I do remember that near the end of my practice, a young guy came in from Crosstown, or Cookville, one was charged with some type of criminal sexual offense. Arrogant, obnoxious, came in. He said, well, I think we got a perfect defense. Well, what is our perfect defense? I didn't know she was 12. I thought she was 14. I said, well, you know, my schedule right now is pretty busy. I'm sorry. But I said it earlier, and I should repeat it, that the practice of law is an honorable profession, and most lawyers, including you, both of you, have just a really great, I mean, the legal profession, in my possible erroneous opinion, has possibly changed a little bit as the decades have gone on. I hope very likely and wrong, but it seems to me that lawyers today that have been admitted to practice for a short period of time, or even 10 or 15 years, maybe, that did not view the practice of law in the way that the 3 of us would have viewed it. Helping people, kind of raising strange issues, raising hell. I mean, just having a little bit of fun in a sense of the word. And maybe, and I hear that there are fewer jury trials being held now. So in reflecting back, and I certainly enjoyed all the way from the military to the years practicing law and the folks I have met. My son-in-law is a real estate closing attorney in Marietta, Georgia, and a great guy. My daughter's a lawyer, although she's now at home taking care of the children. And he seems to be doing well, gets home at reasonable hours, and seems to be doing very well financially from what in the distance I can tell. But he's not going to have any stories when 25 years, what's he going to say to his grandchildren? Son, well, I'll tell you, I had a really exciting closing in Jonesboro 5 years ago. But anyway, guys, that's kind of my view of the practice of law, and I certainly have welcomed the opportunity to share a few of these observations with you, but, again, I enjoyed it and I miss the people more that I worked with and represented and supported more than the actual practice of law and running a law firm. But anyway, it was interesting and I appreciate this opportunity.
Thank you, Lionel Barrett. Thank you very much.
You left a mark. Made a difference.
Thank you, guys. Well, to say it really was very interesting. How late, this is something that you may not remember. It doesn't have anything particular to do with me, but there was a district attorney, I think, maybe somewhere east of here, Cookville or Sparta.
Yeah.
And I think that he had done some things that he shouldn't have done. And it seems like that you were asked to kind of represent the state. Do you have any vague idea?
Yeah, I was a district attorney pro tem.
That Baxter King.
Well, the reason I
No,
mentioned that,
was,
the reason I mentioned that is the limited dealings that I had had with him. He later became a criminal defense lawyer. He had something to do with the Tennessee Association of Criminal Defense. And my memory was that he was one of the few lawyers I met. He was just a jerk. Now, that was just my limited dealings that I had with him. But I remember that you had been appointed district attorney pro tem over some misconduct.
well, the grand jury returned a presentment on its own, and it wasn't a strong case. And I actually cautioned the grand jury about returning an amended indictment, but they did, and the case was going best it could until the so-called victim, during the final argument of defense counsel, she stood up from the balcony and said, "F you and all of you." And I kind of knew right then that the jury was not going to like her very much. She was the victim.
Well, I just remember that, he and I had some disagreements within the Tennessee Association of Criminal Defense Lawyers. He was one of the few lawyers, at least on a very short basis, that I just didn't much care for. But, well, guys, it has been my pleasure.
My pleasure.